Welcome to Minority Matters. I'm your host, Sylvester Smith. Today we're going to discuss the incident in Ferguson, Missouri, which began with the shooting death of an unarmed teenager by a police officer. This incident has once again sparked a debate across this country on the issue of race and created questions about equal justice and social unrest. Today we will not only discuss Ferguson, but also answer the question, could this happen here? Joining me for this discussion are Tawana Bird, an attorney at law here in Little Rock, Arkansas, Dr. Terry Richard, a professor for the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, and the state director of LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, and Dr. Michael Twyman, executive director of the UALR Institute on Race and Ethnicity. Well, I want to thank you all for joining me, and unfortunately I have to say after those lengthy introductions, that's all the time we have.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
But seriously, I know that this is a very important and serious issue, and I think it's most important for us to kind of set the discussion by laying out the allegations. And it seems to me that there are two series of allegations that kind of lay out two separate potential narratives of the events that led up to all of this. There's the one series of allegations that came from the police department saying that the victim was accosting the police officer, and the police officer responded with deadly force to defend himself against the victim. Then there's the narrative that has been provided by the victim's friend, which from the beginning of the incident was the only eyewitness that we knew of at that time, who said, no, that's not the way it happened. And what happened was we were minding our own business and this officer harassed us, and then he just started shooting. So depending on which one of those series of allegations are proven facts will really determine what happens at the end of the day with this investigation. But it's interesting, Dr. Twyman, that depending on who you are and what your background is, you seem more likely to adopt one narrative over the other. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think you touched upon a very important word. You talked about narratives, and I think narratives are very culturally based, and in many ways start with whatever our frame of reference is in terms of how we see the rest of the world, how we see other people, and our interactions with them. So this issue of who is at fault, who is guilty, who is innocent, who was responsible for what, tends to take on a very cultural/racial dimension to it that is not an isolated event, but a part of a larger narrative in this country, and in this particular instance, as it relates to police and community relations. And then to be more specific about white police officers and young black men. And there seems to be a undeniable pattern over and over again with many examples, and some more recent than others, and with growing frequency, that there tends to be some tension and something that is agitating, one, exaggerated interactions between those two demographics. Now, one theory is that, and it bears true, of course, in Ferguson, when you look at the demographics of that community, you look at the composition of the community in terms of race, 67, I believe, percent are African American, a police force of about 60 people, and there are 3 African American officers. Now, is it as simple as that if we increase the number of African Americans or any persons of color in law enforcement officer, do we somehow or another prevent these types of tragedies? That's yet to be seen. What I think is perhaps missing is an understanding, a cultural competency that does not exist often within law enforcement, within persons who are in authority, and are given the responsibility to be in communities and in areas addressing individuals with whom they may have presumptions about who they are and what they may be guilty of or not. I would imagine that Michael Brown also was running a tape in his head based off of some assumptions that he had about law enforcement officers or even perhaps about white men. Unfortunately, these two narratives collided in a very tragic way. And so the one fact that we do know is yet another African-American young man is dead at the hand of a white police officer.
And I would suggest that there are, real issues with labeling that are occurring in our society. Like one, we have a huge issue with sheer arms, the fact that we have police carrying arms and we have individuals in the community who also carry arms. So we can suggest that there is a tendency that there's going to be deadly force and that we live in a society that doesn't want to take action to try to reduce the amount of armament that individuals are carrying, which means we have a higher homicide rate than almost any other industrialized country in the world. Another factor that what I call it a structural issue within our society that has led to this is that we have a much higher poverty level than any other industrialized country in the world, disproportionately affecting African Americans and Latinos. And the byproduct of that is that there are often there's a lack of jobs, lack of job skill training, a sense of alienation from the society, so that this is a situation that is just not in Ferguson, Missouri. This is across our nation. And if one of the issues is, could this happen here? Then yes, it sure could. It could happen in any community. And in fact, it could happen in communities where there's a disproportionate number of Latinos with a white power structure. Or, in another way, it could happen with African Americans being in power and having it with a Latino majority population. And in fact, we've seen that happen in a variety of areas of Texas and California.
I want to touch upon something you said, Dr. Richard, in that, a lot of the young men and women, for that matter, who are on the streets, so to speak, or in urban neighborhoods where oftentimes their way of both defending themselves as well as living their lives is that oftentimes they're packing, they're carrying guns themselves. I think what is so troubling about both the Michael Brown situation and Trayvon Martin, for that matter, is the fact that we're looking at two individuals that didn't have weapons on them. Yet we have law enforcement officers, law enforcement officer in this particular case, not in Trayvon Martin's situation, but a wannabe, that has chosen to use deadly force to deal with an issue when most people you would talk to who are in law enforcement say that they're trained to de-escalate a situation. Yes, are they also taught to be able to defend themselves? Definitely. And I think we as taxpayers want them to defend themselves because they are paid to defend us. We get that. But I think it's something very troubling that we continue to criminalize those on the street who are carrying guns. But, a school of thought would be to say that, well, you need to protect yourself also from law enforcement.
Well, hold on. I think that's a very interesting concept that you've thrown out here. I mean, are you suggesting that more of these young men need to carry weapons so they can be prepared for a potential shootout with law enforcement?
I'm saying that there may have been a different conclusion to the Michael Brown situation if he was carrying a gun, if he had a firearm.
I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, Ms. Bird, because you are a defense attorney. I would think that if Mr. Brown did have a gun, then that would only add to the quality and believability of the police officer's narrative, which is that he was trying to defend himself.
Well, I suspect that we wouldn't still be talking about it today. There's a strong possibility that we wouldn't. I think part of what I believe we might touch on is there's such a frustration with people talking about this whole police killing young black men and no discussion about black men killing young black men. And part, I think, of the frustration is that in most cases, at least the ones that I'm aware of, the alleged murderer generally is apprehended. generally is convicted, generally serves some sort of punishment. Conversely, in situations such as Ferguson, where I don't know of many, if any, examples off the top of my head where there has been a finding, it's just much more common that the police is going to be found to have been doing his job, defending himself.
Probable
and
cause.
so, there was a lawful basis for his use of force. And that frustration for communities can't be squelched, because I don't think people are any less upset about a black boy killing a black boy.
Right.
But there's going to be an outcome where someone is going to feel closure a much larger percentage of the time. And in these cases, case after case after case, there's an expectation that this officer, just like all the rest of them, will get to keep their job, they'll keep a gun, and it may happen again. And I think that's a large part of the unrest.
I agree.
So then your theory is that the reason, because I agree with you, in my life experience, my personal experience and the things I've seen and read, especially here locally, when a black man dies, it's normally at the hands of another black man. But we never see protests about that. We never see people marching down the street in anger and saying enough when it's one black man killing another. But when it's a police officer...
And I disagree with that. I think there is, at least as far as I'm aware, there's a considerable amount of frustration and tension, and speak about that very issue. It's not getting TV press.
Right.
But it's happening. People are. I think there are a number of people who want to take their communities back. We don't live in the village anymore. I call it the village. That's where I grew up. The whole neighborhood took care of everybody. We don't really live that way anymore. But the elders who are still out there, and those of us who think like I do, it's my responsibility to stand up against killing of a black man, of a black woman, of a boy, a girl, especially at the hands of our own, as much, if not more, than in a situation like Ferguson.
We live in a society, in some ways, that's got third world elements to it, because not only did Al Sharpton say, where is the rage against the black on black violence, that we don't see the protests and stuff as regards this high homicide rate, which ultimately leads to a much larger incarceration rate, and that there are real issues with once again, the sheer, like they were talking about within Ferguson, that they hear gunshots all the time. And this is something we hear in Little Rock. And so then you got a situation where police feel they got to carry guns. To deal with the guns are already out there. This is already a situation set up for violent confrontation. And we're not talking about it. We're not talking about why are we letting NRA and gun advocate groups control what happens in our society, in some ways trying to help reduce the level of violence that exists within our society.
And I think also systemic racism coupled with economic conditions. Most times when you see black on black crime, and people talk about it all the time, it is crime of convenience. Black people are not necessarily face to face, body to body to lots of other white people. So if there is going to be crime committed against one another, they're most times living in all black neighborhoods. And we have a history, both past and current, of segregation in terms of our housing, in terms of every city across this country. And so when you put people in situations whereby they still have to eat, and if a part of their ability to do so is surviving, and it's at the loss of someone else's life, it does not excuse personal accountability, but understand that it's not that I think that young black brothers are waking up in the morning and saying, I'm going to go take another brother out. Yeah. No, I got to eat today. I got to, it's about this drug deal. It's about this gang that I'm in who's, made this my arch. So there is a system of racism that feeds off of having particularly people of color to be pitted against one another, so that some of the work in terms of the annihilation of a race is at the hands of the people who are part of the race.
Well, let me back up a little bit, because Dr. Richard, you were talking about the role that guns play in so many of these deaths, and I think that anyone who challenges that would be being less than objective. But wouldn't it be fair to say also that men have killed other men since the time of rocks, and when rocks were all they had. I mean, we read about parents drowning their children. We read about children harmed in microwaves. I mean, if you remove the guns, do you really believe that you end the violence?
Yeah, primarily because if you do it on a comparative study of other nations that have these types of gun restriction laws, and it doesn't mean eliminating rifles, kind of like Sweden. Almost every Swede owns a rifle, but they do not allow handguns. It's illegal, you are punished, and they have severe penalties for possession of those guns. Ours is a Pandora's box. We've let everybody own guns. So you were talking about it could be gang members or it could be somebody wanting to live, but in many cases, sometimes just somebody that is angry.
Angry.
They get upset, they got a gun, and you read it in the papers all the time, and they shoot somebody. There's nothing to hold them back. And in fact, we would suggest it's disproportionately among individuals who have, what have they got to lose? If they don't have good jobs, they don't have an income, they're just, basically trying to make it. They're alienated as they can be. What have they got to lose by taking somebody's life? They're not thinking about it.
They have a sense of powerlessness.
But if they've got nothing to lose and they're that angry, the only difference between shooting a person and stabbing them is the distance. Would they not just pick up a knife and stab them if all handguns were?
It's really hard to kill somebody with knives. It happens with knives, but let me tell you, that act of actually doing it, seeing the blood spurting, the guns are just so much more effective at being able to kill somebody. And again, other societies that control, that have that gun legislation, it's empirical evidence that it does have an impact.
Let's focus more on the incidents at hand, because while what you're saying is there are certainly fair points, in this incident, it was a police officer who had the gun, and I don't know that any of us would argue that we don't want our police officers to be armed. So let's
not be armed.
I'm sorry?
Not be armed or be armed.
That any of us would argue that we want them to not be armed.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Yeah, thank you for that. I don't want someone to think I'm advocating for the British system of policing here in America. So let's talk then about, let's move on from, we had a very good conversation before the cameras came on about the difference between facts and allegations. And this side of the table wanted to refer to the two different narratives as allegations. And Dr. Richard, you felt that some of them were facts. Let's have that conversation now. What are your thoughts? What have we heard that is factually based in your opinion?
Well, we know that for a fact that a convenience store was reported being robbed. We have videotape, and and it's not an allegation, it's literally the video. You can see Michael Brown actually accosting and kind of physically having an altercation with an individual. By the way, that does not justify physical force against this individual, But and we also know the facts in terms of that apparently the confrontation between the two, they're still going to have to go through a investigation determining whether Michael Brown was retreating or whether or not he was actually coming forward. I think his companion indicated that he bum rushed the police officer. In other words, there's statements that indicate what was happening in this altercation. Again, my suggestion would be that the way the police handle this is absolutely wrong. There have to be other mechanisms than drawing your gun and using deadly force on somebody, but just because they're rushing you, there's got to be other mechanisms. And part of that could be that particularly training in small town areas of the United States is just woefully lacking. Then that there have to be other measures, other things that they can have that would de-escalate that particular event. We do know that the byproduct of that has been a series of confrontations, protests. There were small numbers of individuals that looted areas, and a lot of that relates to what I would call the structural conditions that we allow high levels of poverty to exist, that we really don't have the lateral mobility of occupations available for many of our young Black and young Latino men to move up and have something to live for, so that they don't have to worry about, doing something that is criminal in activity, but is kind of a release for them. So so we know a lot of those factors. How they're interpreted is very different. The actual process of the shooting, as well as the other process of looting, is interpreted by some groups as justification, and again, once again, a labeling of African Americans, which is we can't accept it. It's repulsive, but that's what's happening.
I'd like Ms. Bird to respond to some of this.
I read something just in the last couple of days, and it was referred to as the ritual, as relates to when young black boys are shot and or killed by police. There's the death. There's the initial frustration, outrage. There's the spin. And in this case, I call the spin that robbery video that he refers to, which it was later stated was not directly related in any way to this officer's contact.
And the store owner had not reported a robbery.
Hadn't reported a robbery. And the video itself, from a defense attorney's perspective, does not reflect a robbery.
No.
It shows a gentleman, a guy, pushing someone as he exits the store. That doesn't tell me that it was a robbery. And in light of the fact that the store owner hadn't reported a robbery, I can't qualify that as a fact. And again, I said before we started that sometimes thoughts leave me as quickly as they come, so I can't really complete that thought. So I'm gonna turn over to my friend right here while it comes back to me.
Well, yeah, but I just think the larger point is that it's been very selective. So I'm going to go to the spin element of the process and the ritual. It's interesting how the law enforcement officers there have been so careful not to provide much of any transparency, even telling us in terms of what's to happen next and in a timeline. But that particular piece of video could be leaked fairly early on in the process. And then there are other things, however, that we're still all wanting to know, but we're not certain because it's forthcoming or it's still under investigation. So I think it's very selective in terms of what is provided and what's not provided, and I think that's very unfortunate. And I think a lot of the social unrest that you see in the community is that lack of transparency and a lack of integrity upon elected officials and those in authority who are not being communicative or even perhaps forthright and honest in terms of the investigation and how they're handling it.
And that I was going to say, and part of what I was going to say is the spin, which was represented by this video, is how many times have we seen after the killing, the first thing we get to see is how bad this, now we believe, victim was. And so does that justify the death? And if not, what is the purpose in revealing that video?
Well, I mean, I certainly understand. I'm a public relations professional in addition to practicing law, and I do understand the purpose of that video, and I think it's just what you said. But I do have to disagree with you. I'm also a defense attorney from time to time, and I would have to admit that while that video certainly does not prove a robbery, it is certainly excellent circumstantial evidence of a robbery. If a person who claims that they own something says you took it, and then there's video of you holding that thing and shoving them away, I mean, it doesn't prove robbery, but it supports the theory that a robbery occurred. Well, let's talk a little bit about the political process here in this community, because this community is 67% African American, but it seems like the power base does not reflect the majority of the citizens in any way, shape, form, or fashion, or you would imagine there would be more transparency, there would be more responsiveness. How much of, I'm not going to say the incident, but the way the government, the local government, has responded to the incident is a direct result of the lack of the participation in the political process by the majority of those citizens there?
Well, I would certainly think that there are a number of issues that are raised. One is that the issue that has emerged that we're all going to have to deal with, which is the militarization of our police force, you know, and in many cases using weapons designed for terrorism in our own population, and that in many cases these, and you could tell by the way the armament, the attempt to crowd control, that much of what was used would be used against large-scale kind of criminal elements. And there is a real debate going on as to why are we doing this, and that creates a confrontational aspect to this whole situation of mistreatment. There's already a sense of police brutality, police oppression, a repression within the political community by not being represented, and then to treat them in that particular way just continues to aggravate the situation within our society.
And I think, I was going to talk earlier about fear and perceptions. You talked about the fact that you wouldn't want to see our police be unarmed, and because of a lack of training or whatever else, a lot of police officers are now in a position of authority, some of whom have never had it. And the very fact that we know that there are guns on the streets and they may have these interactions, and even if you live in an otherwise peaceful community, every day is a risk when you're a police officer. So there's a great deal of fear that might not manifest itself until you're in the circumstance. But how do you deal with that? And I think training is a large part of that. And on the flip side, for the young black man, as I understand it, I don't have any sons, but most boys and men whom I know in the African American community, whether they're poor or whether they have a PhD and live in a gated community, have anxiety and fear when it comes to being stopped by the police, because you don't know what you're going to get, and there's an anticipation that that's going to be a negative interaction.
That is exactly right.
Well, guys, I've got about 15 seconds left. So, Dr. Twyman, any closing thoughts, especially as they relate to how this could potentially happen here, or what we should do to try to keep it from happening here?
I think that we, as a country, have to really challenge ourselves to look beyond our racial divide and really see justice as truly being colorblind. My heart continues to bleed for James Foley, his parents, his family. When I see the loss of their son, I react as a human. It doesn't matter that if he were black, I wouldn't hurt any more or hurt any less. I want us as a country to begin to see human life as just that.
I think that's great. Well, I want to thank each one of our guests. I want to thank our audience for watching as always. And I think I'd like to say that I give my condolences to the Brown family. They all lost a loved one. And I think this has been a great conversation today. And I certainly, as a young black man growing up in the South, I've been profiled and I've had negative interactions with the police. And as a child of a police officer, I watched my dad go out each day and put his life on the line to keep our community safe. And I wondered many nights if he would make it home. So I can really understand both sides of this issue. And I think that what Dr. Twyman said is key. We need to remember that this is all human life, and we need to try to come up with a better way to understand each other. Thank you, and with that, we'll see you next month.